How's it everyone who's watching this? This is my 81st video on the channel, and today we're starting yet another book, Signs and Machines by Maurizio Lazzarato. This is quite an interesting work, analysing the ways in which capitalism essentially produces subjectivity through semiotic functions that go far beyond just language, or the signifier and signified. By applying a framework that draws heavily from the work of Guattarian, Lazzarato explores themes like machinic enslavement and social subjection, the place of a-signifying semiotics, and how signs work in relation to capital on a more general level. Before we begin, I just wanted to mention that the formatting of these videos is going to be a little different than usual for a while. I'm currently moving and don't have access to a computer or Stardew. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. Quite fittingly, the very first section of Chapter 1 is titled Social Subjection and Machinic Enslavement. Lazzarato begins by arguing that Guattari and his collaborator Gilles Deleuze essentially brought Marx's discoveries to fulfillment, particularly the notion that production depends on abstract and subjective activity that cannot be reduced to any purely political or linguistic representation. They managed to accomplish this through the development of the two concepts that give their names to this section. As Lazzarato himself puts it,
the production of wealth and production period operates at the intersection of two heterogeneous power apparatuses, social subjection and machinic enslavement.
Social subjection is probably the more intuitive of the two. Basically, this is the process that assigns identities, or more specifically, establishes individual subjects. Under subjection, a someone, defined by their gender, race, sexuality, job, and so on, is given a place or role in the social. They are made one cleanly delimited person, a subject pure and simple. From a more semiotic point of view, subjection can be characterized as firmly tied to language. A whole web of representations of what it means to be this or to be that serve to ground the process. Turning back to Marx specifically, Lazzarato explains that subjection essentially makes the relations of capital into personified things. A capitalist, caught in their web, is capital personified, whilst the worker is labor personified. This is all in slightly uneasy contrast with machinic enslavement, another mode linked to subjectivity. If social subjection fundamentally serves to individuate things, to make distinct people, then enslavement is about the inverse. From this point of view, there are no delimited workers or individuals. Instead, there are only cogs in machines. A very basic example that I'm drawing from Guattari's first seminar is driving a car whilst tired. When you start slipping from full consciousness to a more reflexive state, you move from subjection to enslavement. Your reflexes essentially become a part of the machinism of a car, instead of belonging to a complete and individual you, firmly separated from anything else. Through our semiotic lens, we can consider enslavement as distinct from language. It deals with a-signifying or diagrammatic things, not the representation of subjection. When put next to each other, this dual apparatus of power thus works with two different kinds of subjects, to put it a bit loosely. Unlike the individuals of social subjection, machinic enslavement is more a matter of what Deleuze terms dividuals. To borrow Lazzarato's own words,
the dividual functions in enslavement in the same way as the non-human component parts of technical machines, as organizational procedures, semiotics, and so on.
This can be understood in terms of a separation between person and machine. In the case of social subjection, there's a firm divide between subject and object. The first exists relative and outside of the second, with the individuated person making use of objects like hammers without there being any blurring between the two. However, in the logic of machinic enslavement, such an object-subject distinction simply just doesn't exist. Rather, the individual merges with machines, going from making use of objects to becoming a part of them. In this register, you can't really separate the animate from the inanimate, the someone from the something, or the agent from the instrument. As the line between subject and object melts away, even intersubjectivity fails. Although dividuals and so on do interact, they do not do so as people, but as inputs and outputs, terminals for functions. It's in this way that Lazzarato describes enslavement as not only making the individual a piece of a machine, but also as tearing them to pieces. When you leave subjection, there's no longer any unified I or me, but we're encompassed in that individuated subject, like affects, thoughts, and memories, become components for an assemblage or process, not some cleanly delimited self. As Lazzarato explains, it is thus that this side of subjectivation specifically works by deterritorializing subjects and objects. To put it a bit bluntly, enslavement literally breaks down the territory of a self. Instead of one coherent whole, there are a bunch of subjective molecules that cannot really be captured in representation, properly speaking. Lazzarato discusses this in terms of deterritorialized or decoded flows of abstract labor and signs. These flows act as outputs and inputs that are largely divorced from individuals or even human subjectivity more generally. They are specifically centered around what our author describes as enormous social machinisms, which can be found in corporations, the infrastructure of a welfare state, and so on. From this perspective, power relations are incredibly important in capitalism, but they are first and foremost constructed by social machines and the technical machines assisting them. In Lazzarato's own words,
capital is not a mere relationship among people, nor is it reducible to an intersubjective relationship as Hannah Arendt suggests, for whom there is not an ounce of matter in human action.
Connecting all of this to neoliberalism more specifically, this gives us the tools to understand what it means to say that our current capitalist economy is a subjective economy. At the end of the day, the market, as it currently works, will not humanize the alienated subject, to paraphrase Lazzarato quite closely. Instead, the neoliberal economy is subjective insofar as it uses subjectivity for the machine, exploiting subjective components through enslavement. To put this another way, subjection fundamentally serves enslavement in Lazzarato's eyes. The kind of hierarchization that comes with cutting out individuals and assigning them identities is something that can be organized and tapped into by machinism, breaking away from the idea of power relations being personal. Concluding this section, Lazzarato writes,
"The fact that in the current economy one speaks does not bring us back to the linguistic turn and the intersubjectivity of speakers. It is indicative of a machine-centric world in which one speaks assisted."
With this, we get to part 2 of the chapter, titled Human Machine versus Humans Machines. Here, Lazzarato is mainly focused on ergonomics, the study of how humans interact with other parts of systems, as offering a concrete example of the process of enslavement. He starts by drawing a line between the human-machine binary and systems of humans-machines, described in the plural. Essentially, whilst the former is basically reducible to things like the subject-object divide, the latter describes assemblages where heterogeneous mixtures of components interact without any firm separation between the human and non-human. In ergonomics, such systems are said to be fully expressible in terms of information. For Lazzarato, the exciting thing about this particular framework is that it strips away anthropocentric conceptions of that information. Unlike, say, certain strands of cybernetics, we don't deal with how organisms respond to certain signals. Likewise, it stands distinct from communication theory and models grounded on the notion of individuated subjects that can emit and receive things. Ergonomics deals with inputs and outputs, nothing more, nothing less. To turn towards philosophy, Guattari, as we have already somewhat seen, thinks about enslavement in pretty similar terms. It deals with what he describes as ontologically ambiguous entities, or objectities subjectities. These are both subjects and objects at the same time, or at least in a state somewhat similar to that of superposition. Starting with objects, Lazzarato, drawing heavily from Guattari, contends that things like machines, diagrams, and software can basically lose their objectivity and become little nuclei for subjectivity to emerge. He expresses this with a list of verbs. These subjectic objects suggest, enable, solicit, prompt, encourage, and prohibit thoughts, feelings, actions, and so on. Invoking Foucault, Lazzarato identifies such verbs as being closely connected to the nature of power relations. Going beyond intersubjectivity, or rather any paradigm that falls back on the idea of such relations occurring between individual humans, our author argues that the non-human dimension is just as important when trying to understand how power works. As Lazzarato himself puts it,
non-humans contribute just as humans do to defining the framework and conditions of action. One always acts within an assemblage where machines, objects, and signs are at the same time agents.
Continuing with the theme of intersubjectivity, Lazzarato doesn't deny the concept itself. In fact, when it comes to subjection, intersubjectivity is incredibly important. The problem he has with it is how many theorists seem to make it the be-all and end-all of subjectivation. It relies on consciousness and representations of subjects, things that simply aren't there in the other register of subjectivation, that of machinic enslavement. In an almost paradoxical way, this other mode is concerned with both more and less than the person, individual, or intersubjectivity generally. This is because it concerns both what we can describe as pre-personal and suprapersonal forces. On the one hand, there are things like affects, senses, desires, and perception, all of which can be incorporated into a person, but which are not linked to one by necessity. In fact, these elements can be considered as the pieces out of which a person is constructed. However, on the other hand, enslavement also deals with bigger things, machinic, linguistic, social, mediatic, and economic things. With the pre-personal, we have all the little molecules from before, and with the suprapersonal, we have all the forces that serve to machine those. To close off this relatively small taste of Lazzarato's semiotic approach to capitalism, it would probably be worth it to look at how subjection and enslavement compare as a whole. As we have already discussed, the basic difference is that the former develops supposedly false subjects, separated from other individuals around them, whilst the latter instead deals with dividuals that can be used as components for machines. Additionally, whilst subjection is representational, enslavement is fundamentally a-signifying. After all, you don't consciously become one with the car when you get tired, nor can you have a typical representation of such ontologically ambiguous things. What this comes down to is Guattari's distinction between the molar and the molecular, which I've already hinted at throughout this video. The various features of subjection, such as representation, individuation, and consciousness, can all be grouped under the header of molar, whilst enslavement is molecular through its specifically non-representational, non-individual, and ultimately machinic nature. However, although it's sometimes tempting, shifting to the vocabulary of molecular and molar should not lead us to think about enslavement as smaller than subjection, or to think in scale-based terms at all. I think Lazzarato puts it quite well.
Molecular or machinic, the terms are synonymous, indicate a difference in kind and not in scale with the molar dimension of individuated subjects, representation, and consciousness.
Although the specifics of this will get clearer as we continue through the book, A good example of why this kind of mapping doesn't really work is clear in the supra-personal side of enslavement. A mediatic machine, spread across streaming services, advertising, newspapers, and so on, cannot be considered as some sort of molar individual. No matter how massive or how far-reaching its tendrils are, it is still fundamentally molecular. The final dimension to this division is that of the transcendence of subjection and the immanence of enslavement. As Lazzarato relates, subjection basically pigeonholes the subjects it creates into specific models that are often binary, like worker-capitalist or teacher-student. These are transcendent insofar as the models are external and above the subjects jammed into them. Enslavement, in contrast, is all about the immanence of unfolding processes. Returning to the car example once again, the becoming vehicle that comes with your reflexes taking over is just something that, well, happens. There's no attempt at fitting into some beyond of sorts. There's simply an assemblage of heterogeneous components that take shape directly, without the need for mediation. It's with this that I like to make one final note. Although Lazzarato is not always clear in this regard, subjection and enslavement are not really negative on any inherent level. Instead, they are just two particularly prominent modes of subjectivation that can take all sorts of forms. Just because enslavement can have awful consequences under neoliberalism in some of its guises, that doesn't mean reflexes interfacing with a car are bad by necessity. At the end of the day, social subjection and machinic enslavement are dimensions or tools and nothing else, ones that can be applied for better or for worse. In Lazzarato's words,
Capitalism owes its efficacy and power to the fact that it joins two heterogeneous dimensions of subjectivity, the molar and the molecular, individual and pre-individual.
It's on this note that we conclude the first two sections of Signs and Machines by Maurizio Lazzarato, having examined the general roles of social subjection and machinic enslavement in the production of subjectivity. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong or wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better. Next time, we'll either be continuing with this book or looking at a paper of my own that was recently accepted for publication about disability, time, and Guattari's four functors. Until then, bye.